Hi and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Robert E. Howard's pulp series Conan the Barbarian, and more specifically the novelette that was first published in Weird Tales magazine, The Phoenix on the Sword. So I want to start with a little bit of background on Robert E. Howard. You rarely hear this author's name anymore, but Robert E. Howard was a great pulp writer who, although he killed himself at the age of 30, is considered to be the father of the sword and sorcery genre of fantasy literature. Howard wrote not just in fantasy, but in a diverse range of genres, including westerns, horrors, fantasy literature, detective fiction, and even a genre called Weird Western, which is essentially a combination of horror and western. So Howard's Conan the Barbarian was actually a rewrite of his earlier creation, Cole the Conqueror. Cole the Conqueror was a hero that was supposed to be an introspective, savage barbarian, although, of course, his later creation, Conan the Barbarian, ends up being the more popular, enduring, lasting character. So in this video, we're going to look at the first official Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. Robert Howard was depressed for a lot of his life. And as you can see, 1906 to 1936, he did most of his productive work between the ages of 23 and 30. He was, interestingly enough, if you think about his character Conan, he was a little bit like Conan himself in the sense that Howard was an avid weightlifter and an amateur boxer, actually. Some of his big influences were H.P. Lovecraft, especially, but also Edgar Allan Poe. And I think it would be best to define his style as poetic lyricism. There's some existentialism in there, hard-boiled realism, violent grimness, and most of what he does is that sort of pulpy noir tough guy lit that he's known so well for. So in this video, we're going to look at the first official Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, which was published as a novelette in the pulp magazine Weird Tales in December 1932. Weird Tales would ultimately publish another 16 Conan stories, some novels, some novelettes. An interesting thing to note about Howard's approach, while Howard was meticulous in the world building that he did for Conan, he even wrote an 8,600 word history on the Hyborian Age, and was very detailed in his approach to world building. He didn't write the series in a linear fashion. Howard's first story, the one that we're about to examine, introduces Conan as King of Aquilonia, the most powerful kingdom in the age. In later stories, however, Howard will actually take us back and forth, telling stories that chronicle his earlier days as a thief and a barbarian and an adventurer, and then his later days as a man defending his kingdom. And there's a good reason for that, as Howard himself once explained. In writing these yarns, I've always felt less as creating them than as if I were simply chronicling his adventures as he told them to me. That's why they skip about so much, without following a regular order. The average adventurer telling tales of a wild life at random seldom follows any ordered plan, but narrates episodes widely separated by space and years, as they occur to him. So, after Howard's death, his Conan stories became widely appreciated and have had a place in the culture ever since. In fact, Howard's creation was adapted to film in 1982 in Conan the Barbarian, written by Oliver Stone and John Milius, and starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. The film was followed up by a sequel in 1984 called Conan the Destroyer. And even more recently, in 2011, they made another one starring Jason Momoa, and I hear this one wasn't very good. So over the years, writers and editors have even gone back into Howard's manuscripts for unfinished tales to doctor up and rewrite for publication, like The Snout in the Dark, which was a fragment later reworked by writers Lynn Carter and Elsbreg de Camp. I should also mention that Conan was turned into a successful comic book Marvel series called Conan the Barbarian, and that was by Roy Thomas and the artist Barry Windsor Smith. The comic was eventually so successful that it gave rise to a black and white spin-off magazine, also from Marvel, called The Savage Sword of Conan, which was aimed at adult audiences. That too was very successful, which is why it lasted from 1974 all the way up to 1995. The last thing I want to mention as a kind of introduction to The Phoenix on the Sword is that Howard's stories have been extremely influential. Beside the comic books and the films, figures like J.R.R. Tolkien were inspired by Robert E. Howard. And if you read Lord of the Rings, you can actually see some of Howard's influence in interesting ways, some of the themes and symbols and tropes. And even modern figures like Barack Obama have attested their love for the Conan stories. He said that he collected the comic books. Apparently, Barack Obama is also featured in one of the magazines, although I can't speak to that because I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that particular issue of the comics, but apparently Marvel put him in one of the Conan comics. So now for Phoenix on the Sword. This work that we're going to get into is Howard's first published Conan story, and it starts with a middle-aged Conan, Conan of Cimmeria, as he's attempting to govern the turbulent kingdom of Aquilonia. Conan has recently seized the crown of Aquilonia from King Numedides after slaying him, but he's having a tough time ruling Aquilonia because he's more suited to swinging his broadsword than engaging in the business of governing. Also, the citizens who originally welcomed Conan as their liberator, right? He killed their tyrant king. They've started to turn against him too because of his foreign Cimmerian blood. They've even constructed a statue to their former king Numedides to his memory in the temple of Mitra, who is a god in this world. And there are priests and burning incenses before the king and people making pilgrimages to the site. And people are starting to say that the king was slain by a red-handed barbarian, right? So basically, the story centers around a group of rebels. They're called the Rebel Four, who wish to give the Aquilonian crown to someone of royal blood, and they hatch a plot to essentially kill Conan, King Conan. And so basically the story is a bunch of resentful former nobles who are attempting to assassinate King Conan, right? And so before we talk about the story, I just want to get into what sort of makes it special as a work of literature. In The Phoenix on the Sword, again, it's 1932 there, the narrative perspective shifts back and forth between the rebels' perspective as they get together and scheme and conspire and plot to kill Conan, which is going to be a very hard thing to do. And then, of course, Conan's perspective. So it goes back and forth. There's lots of dialogue, lots of storytelling using long monologues. There's pulpy themes, imagery, language, characters. Howard uses a kind of inflated, romantic, literary style, but he juxtaposes that with sort of hard-boiled, fast-moving fight scenes and passages of exposition that give you world building that are concise and things like that. So the story starts out with a preface, and it really gets into the preface really details the setting of the story and also describes Conan. So the story is set in a, quote, undreamed of age, between the years when the oceans drank both Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Aryas. I should note that the sons of Aryas, this is a group that rose and conquered the world and are considered essentially ancestors of the Aryan or Proto-Indo-European peoples. And so you'll notice that this fantasy setting takes place in an age undreamt of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. So it's got this fantasy setting, but it also takes place on Earth, on the planet Earth, somewhere in deep history, somewhere between the years when Atlantis existed, and then, of course, sort of a more modern European setting. And so Howard goes on to detail these shining kingdoms, and they include Nemedia, Hyperborea, Zamora with its dark-haired women in towers of spider-haunted mystery, Zingara with its chivalry, Koth that bordered on the pastoral lands of Shem, Stygia with its shadow-guarded tombs, Hyrcania whose riders wore steel and silk and gold, but the proudest kingdom of the world was Aquilonia, reigning supreme in the dreaming west. And so that is where Conan rules, although he is from Cimmeria. And so it's in this same preface that we meet Conan the Barbarian, the Cimmerian. He is described as being black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. So, as Howard gets into the story in part one, we get to learn more about what's going on, more about the plot. So, in a small room inside a dim alley in Aquilonia, the Stygian Toth Amon meets with the outlaw Ascalante to discuss plans to assassinate King Conan. By the way, Toth Amon is actually a slave of Ascalante, but he's also a wizard. And he loses the ring that makes him powerful, and that way Ascalante is able to make him his slave. Ascalante, the former Count of Thun, has been using a group of resentful former nobles, the Rebel Four, to sow unrest in the city, to rile people up, to turn people against Conan. And the group is getting together and plotting to ultimately assassinate King Conan. Ascalante has worked with his conspirators to rid the city, essentially, of the imperial soldiers, to rid the city of aids, to find excuses for the army of Aquilonia to leave and fight these hordes that are around the borders. Ascalante makes sure that Conan's door guards are gone, that his escorts are going to be gone, and that Conan's right-hand man, Prospero, is going to be gone as well. So this is an intricate plot to make sure that when they go to assassinate Conan and gang up on him and kill him and take the throne, that Conan's men are going to be gone and unable to help him. So that leaves only the king's personal bodyguard in the city, and then also the Black Legion. And then Ascalante says, "Through Grommel, I've corrupted a spendthrift officer of that guard and bribed him to lead his men away from the king's door at midnight. Then, with 16 desperate rogues of mine, we're going to enter the palace by a secret tunnel. After the deed is done, even if the people do not rise to welcome us, Grommel's Black Legion will be sufficient to hold the city and the crown." So the characters that are in the Rebel Four, and of course they get a larger group to go in and do the deed, are Volmana, the dwarfish Count of Caraban, who basically makes sure that the imperial troops are not going to be in the city when they want to assassinate Conan. And Volmana was formerly a count, and he is interested in killing Conan so that he can be reinstated as a nobleman once more. There's Grommel, who is a giant, and he's commander of the Black Legion. And what he does is he helps to corrupt his own officers, and he makes sure that they're going to be led away from the king's door when the plan is being carried out. So there'll be no one to guard Conan's door. Then there's Dion, the fat baron of Attalus, whose great wealth enabled the Stygian to smuggle liquor over the borders and essentially rile up these hordes of barbarians called the Picts. And then there's Rinaldo. Rinaldo is, Ascalante calls him the harebrained minstrel, but really he's a famous poet. And although he's part of the scheme, Ascalante says he really has no personal ambitions. He just has a prejudice against Conan. He sees Conan as a red-handed, rough-footed barbarian who came out of the north to plunder a civilized land. And he idealizes the king whom Conan killed to get the crown. And so essentially he's got prejudice. He admired the old king, and so that's really his only motivation. Then there's Toth Amon, and I mentioned he's a wizard from the lands of Stygia, and he calls himself Toth Amon of the Ring because he lost a magical ring. And this ring is actually the serpent ring of Set, the god Set, whom, if you remember your ancient Egyptian mythology, Set is the god of chaos. And when the story starts, it is Toth Amon who is scheming with Ascalante, and Ascalante is discussing the plan with Toth Amon. And remember, Toth Amon is also Ascalante's slave. So basically, this whole group has agreed that Dion, the Fat Baron, because he has noble blood, will be the new king once Conan is killed. But what the other members of the group don't know is that once they kill Conan, Ascalante is going to kill everyone else and take over. And once everyone's dead, the crown will be his. And I want to give a quote here. Ascalante says the following to his slave Toth. "The fat fool claims it by reason of a trace of royal blood. Conan makes a bad mistake in letting men who still boast descent from the old dynasty from which he tore the crown of Aquilonia." And here's another great quote from Ascalante, and this kind of just shows you what an Iago-like evil scheming villain he is. "They will continue to think that I serve them until our present task is completed. Who are they to match wits with Ascalante? Volmana, the dwarfish count of Caraban, Grommel, the giant commander of the Black Legion, Dion, the fat baron of Attalus, Rinaldo, the harebrained minstrel. I am the force which has welded together the steel in each, and by the clay in each I will crush them when the time comes. But that lies in the future. Tonight the king dies." So it isn't until part 2 that we actually are introduced for the first time in person to King Conan, who is obviously formerly Conan the Barbarian. And so this scene takes place the night before the coup is carried out, and Conan is sitting there in his castle, and he's completely unaware of the danger, and he's talking to his right-hand man, the knight Prospero, who's a really good sort of Dr. Watson sidekick figure whom Conan relies on. And here's a great introduction here by Howard that gives you a nice description of Conan. "The room was large and ornate, with rich tapestries on the polished paneled walls, deep rugs on the ivory floor, the lofty ceiling adorned with intricate carvings and silver scrollwork. Behind an ivory gold inlaid writing table sat a man whose broad shoulders and sun-browned skin seemed out of place among those luxuriant surroundings. He seemed more a part of the sun and winds and high places of the outlands. His slightest movement spoke of steel spring muscles knit to a keen brain with the coordination of a born fighting man. Either he was perfectly at rest, still as a bronze statue, or else he was in motion, not with the jerky quickness of overtense nerves, but with a cat-like speed that blurred the sight which tried to follow him. His garments were of rich fabric, but simply made. He wore no ring or ornaments, and his mane was confined merely by a cloth of silver band around his head. Now he laid down the golden stylus with which he had been laboriously scrawling on wax papyrus, rested his chin on his fist, and fixed his smoldering blue eyes enviously on the man who stood before him. "Prospero," said the man at the table, "these matters of statecraft weary me, as all the fighting I have done never did." "All part of the game, Conan," answered the dark-eyed Poitanian. "You're king. You must play the part." So in this scene, Conan is confiding in Prospero the difficulties of being king, and how the populace that once welcomed him as a liberator now essentially despises him. Prospero says it's Rinaldo's fault, remember Rinaldo's the poet, and that Conan should have him executed. But Conan disagrees. He says that as a famous poet with a golden tongue, Rinaldo has a greater influence over Conan's image and legacy than Conan does himself. So Rinaldo's songs will outlive me, essentially, is what Conan's saying. And Conan doesn't want to blame Rinaldo or kill him.